So my presentation is entitled Oedipus, Unbound, Heutagogic Journeys Beyond a Working Class Wilderness. Sounds very grand. Now, I've started with a piece of music, and you can see on the slide that it's a song called Telling Stories by the Charlatans. And the reason why I've picked this is because my presentation today is in the form of a story. So I'm going to be telling you aspects of my biography, my heritage, where I come from, the experiences that I've had. And as part of this, as part of my early life and subsequent development to where I am now, an academic at Liverpool John Moores University, music has always been incredibly powerful and important. Now, I have a kind of strange, almost mysterious relationship with music, in that I will hear a song and I will hear some lyrics, and sometimes it doesn't happen, very often, but sometimes a song will just kind of embed within me. And the meaning of the song won't actually be immediately apparent. I'll just kind of archive it, and then at some point in the future, the reason why it was so meaningful will become apparent. Now, I first heard this song Telling Stories way back it will have been 1997, I think, and I was walking down the high street in Preston with a friend who is now a colleague called Dave Hayes, who's based at the University Centre at Blackpool College. And we were just walking, going past a few shops, and I heard this song, and it powerfully resonated with me, and stayed with me. Now, I've written about other bands and other songs previously, like the Stone Roses, but I've never actually written about this song or considered it up to this point. I was actually driving, I was going on a journey the other day, thinking about what I was going to bring for the detail on this presentation, and this song came back to me. So 23 years in the future, for me, this is one of the reasons why it became so meaningful. So Telling Stories. In relation to being working class, I'm not going to say too much about this because Kit's already covered it fantastically. So for me, being working class is not about metrics, it's not about measurement, it's not about kind of economic considerations. For me, it's about history, it's about my history, it's about heritage, it's about identity, it's about the values and the cultural environments that I was brought up in, whether that be in the family, an extended family or community, and also schooling environments, and how they impacted on me to shape me as a particular person. Now, I remember, I kind of recall my time at school, so primary school, junior school. I was incredibly interested, and I felt an affinity to the more creative type activities. I loved painting and drawing and daydreaming and singing to myself. I loved the space that kind of stuff afforded for me. But those experiences were very few and far between. And more often than not, they were hijacked by then the necessity to do subjects and study certain kinds of subjects and certain types of knowledge in ways that just didn't mean anything for me. So that's the kind of stuff I'm going to cover. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. I'm just going to pick out that kind of the key lyric there for me, when the stories that you tell come back to haunt you. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about Oedipus, which might seem a little bit obscure, and indeed it is in some respects. But I am, or at least I was, Oedipus. Oedipus, just to explain, the name Oedipus actually means swollen foot. And in the myth, Sophocles' Greek myth, Oedipus's ankles were bound after birth. And the reason why his parents bound his ankles was to try to thwart the prophecy, the prediction that had been actually placed upon him by the oracle that he was going to kill his father and marry his mother. So his ankles were bound, but ultimately he did actually pursue his kind of fate, his destiny, so that the kind of binding of the ankles didn't work in that sense. So for me, I'm not going to talk about my mum and dad in this presentation for many reasons. What I am going to talk about is the process of schooling, early formative schooling. And in my experience, bearing in mind that this was back in the 1970s, primary and junior school for me, and this was a time, before the national curriculum. You kind of think of what, Gove and Cummings have done to education since, it's even worse. But my experience of formal education is that it was a process that actually bound my ankles. So I've already mentioned that I felt an affinity with creativity and being artistic and expressive and expressionistic, and just trying to make sense in my own way of the world around me. With hindsight, I have intelligence. Sometimes that's debatable, but but it's a very strange kind of intelligence. I can't kind of rote memorize information. I generally can't do that unless I'm interested in it and it links into a project that I'm doing. So when I was confronted with these subjects and topics and assessments and grades, etc., at schooling, and I was kind of categorized and compartmentalized, it made no sense to me. So schooling actually served to bind my feet. The experience of education made no sense to me. Interestingly, in relation to this notion of Oedipus, Karl Popper talks about the Oedipus effect and how a prediction, when it is spoken onto somebody, it's the power of narrative, it's the power of prophecy. So the things that those teachers said to me back then stayed with me. The stories that they told me kind of haunted me for a long time, up until my 20s. Now, I haven't got the time to go into my kind of detailed biography, but kind of suffice to say, I joined the army. I worked in a factory as a weaver for 5 years. But then in my 20s, I started to generate and experience a very different kind of relationship with knowledge and education. So moving on to brighter days, shall we say. So telling stories as liberation. And just picking up on the lyric, which again resonated with me all the way back in 1997. I had no idea why, but now it makes perfect sense to me. Revelations to blank pages. So how did I move beyond a heritage that didn't recognize and value higher education and university? Because of my abysmal educational performance as part of my formal educational experience, I left school with very few qualifications. It didn't make any sense to me, and to be perfectly honest, I wasn't bothered at that point. It just seemed totally meaningless. But then in my 20s, music, as I've already mentioned, another reason, music became all the more important. I kind of started to almost think about myself, reflect back on myself and my social positioning at that point. I started to question, why had I had this working class life, these working class experiences? And it wasn't until my 20s that I started to look around and really sort of angrily question, why had I been placed? Why had society, why had the system, why had teachers, why had other influential people placed me and kind of labeled me and prophesied me into that particular place? And music became a wonderful escape, but also a powerful mechanism of self-discovery. So it was in my 20s that I started to study with the Open University. way back in 1994, I think it will have been, the D103 foundation course in social sciences, which introduced me to politics, philosophy, sociology. And what I found able to do was kind of use my kind of the creative side to me with film, music, poetry, art, and actually combine this. And it gave me a voice, it gave me a narrative, it gave me a powerful way of thinking about and speaking about my experiences and the extent to which I wanted to challenge those experiences. And it was a very different approach to education. I know that things have changed now in kind of further and higher education, and it is much more constricted. But way back in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, I found, and I'm thankful that I found, that there were some lecturers that were kind of prepared to allow me to, in a sense, vent my anger, because there were things I needed to explore. And through kind of creative assignments and allowing me to bring my narrative and biography into education, I started to explore things and make powerful connections. So this, importantly, I'm going to start to tease out just a few concepts in a minute, because I'm a philosopher of education and I just feel that I have to do it. So this experience was powerful because it created space where I could actually bring myself, my own reference points, my own history, heritage into the academic environment, and I could dissect it and critique it and also write powerfully and creatively about it. So it presented opportunities for me for open, reflective, and in a sense, and now this wasn't universally the experience for me in higher education as an undergraduate, but there were still moments, there were still examples and modules that also enabled me to bring in aspects of what I would call creative writing, which is incredibly important. So through this process, my ankles were slowly unbound. So certainly the encounters with learning, music, film were a key part of this. How are we doing for time? Okay, so starting to draw things to a close. Now with hindsight, the experiences that I had in education, the few liberating experiences in education, kind of chime with what I've become interested in recently with heutagogic, which is very distinct and different to pedagogy or pedagogy. So pedagogy is a kind of traditional approach to education, which translates as to lead the child, to lead the boy, paidos, agogos. Whereas heutagogy is an approach to knowledge and learning engagement that is based on self-determined learning. It was only developed from year 2000 onwards, and there's kind of key publication there that you can see in 2013. And it's based on this notion of heuriskein, to self-discover. And it's also significantly influenced by Carl Rogers' work on non-directive teaching. Now, these are important because they allow space for people to explore, think about, make their own connections, and to make sense of their own narrative in relation to, a more formalized learning environment. So this is something that I've become increasingly interested in, and I try to incorporate this now into my own practice, because this was the stuff that enabled me to start to change my life and to challenge the heritage and move beyond the heritage. No, I'm not going to use those terms. To actually utilize my heritage in powerful ways. Also linking into this, I'm interested in the work of Michel de Certeau, and his work on the blank page, the dynamic power of the blank page. Because I've been talking about prophecy and prediction and prescription, and my experience of formal education, certainly in the early days, was based on a prescribed model of already established knowledge. There was nothing there for me to inhabit. I just had to memorize information, and it didn't work for me. Whereas for de Certeau, this idea of the blank page, offering myself, offering learners a blank page to create, to start to inhabit a space. So as it says there, a non-populated blank page harbors a power, and a power to be free, to create, and to write something new. So to start to, I'm nearly there, I'm going to bring things to a close. So ultimately, just to make some connections back to where I started, and the charlatans, you know, so a charlatanic system and my early experience of this, it imposed alien expectations, but through being afforded space to engage with and create knowledge in my own way, co-create knowledge in that sense, I've actually learned to transgress the haunting prophecies. Thank you. Any questions? So if you give me a second to read through these, as I said, I've got the strange experience of chairing my own panel. So, right, so I'm going to summarize the question by Alex there. So Alex is querying the balance between helping individuals to cope with and succeed in an unequal system and challenging the construction of those inequalities on the other. Is there a balance? That's a really good question because, and it's a question that my subsequent academic work links into. What I'm kind of regularly confronted with, and necessarily so, is the question from other academics that might be a little critical of my work, because as far as I'm concerned in my academic work, I try to implement what has worked for me. So allowing people to bring in their own narrative, their own autobiographies, their own cultural reference points in order to make their learning a more meaningful experience. Now that's great in an educational sense, but that doesn't necessarily start to challenge the structural inequalities that caused the kind of working class issue in the first place. Now, for me, there is a possible solution because I like to engage with the notion of tactics, pedagogic tactics or heutagogic tactics. So the best that we can do in the interim, in the early stages, is to just try to do our little bit in the spaces that we do inhabit. We're not going to change the structure singularly, but if we start to unite under a shared notion of working class heritages and how that can be used or brought into play for people with certain backgrounds and values and experiences to start to shape the learning experience in ways that are meaningful for them, rather than academics and largely privileged academics shaping and prescribing the learning environment and expecting people to come in and just rote learn and regurgitate that information. So it's not a perfect solution at all, but it's based on this idea of tactics, that we can act individually, but that individual actions can actually be shared by people operating across different contexts. So we can at least start to make some kind of difference. So a question there by Alex Dunedin, who's interested to know how the structures of formal academia deal with the outcomes of self-directed study, as it may not fit conveniently with the categorical rubrics which are used. Do I have any thoughts on this? Yes, I do have thoughts, and again, I've developed a couple of examples of curricular or academic practice, because basically, if I'm inviting a chaotic collective of people coming together, students, a class of maybe 20, 30 people, and I'm inviting them to engage in their own explorations of their own narratives, values, cultural reference points, autobiographies. The work that they ultimately produce is incredibly different, almost infinitely different. So how do I then, as part of a formal academic framework, assess that? How do I make that kind of very bespoke and unique work for each individual student? How do I make that work within a formal academic context? Well, I've devised something called a peer assessment model, which kind of takes the emphasis away from me as a privileged expert and actually devolves the process out to the wider collective. Again, it's not perfect. It's limited in the sense that it's not massively successful with small groups of learners. So you do need quite a number, because then you can give out the peer assessment process to each member of the group. They can generate feedback and a grade for each presenter, and then I can collate and aggregate that information together. And so then each student can get a grade for the work that they produce. again, it's not a perfect solution, but it is, again, it's a tactic that can operate within those kind of contexts. Oh, Joe, blank page can also be a moment of fear. How do you enable bravery? That's a good question. You have, speaking from my experience, you have to give yourself. You have to be yourself, whether it be in an academic environment or anywhere else where you're trying to encourage people to take risks. For me, it's about academic leadership. If I'm expecting other people to take risks, I have to take the risks first. So it is about brave, encouraging other people to be brave, but I have to be brave first. I have to reveal myself if I'm asking other people to, engage in these kinds of activities. Anyway, I'm pretty sure that I've utilized my time allocation there. So I'm going to hand the baton over to Lou,